Imagine living in a luxurious mansion, surrounded by riches, but completely alone. Victor Galvez always believed that success lay in controlling everything around him, until a lost photograph and an unexpected maid changed the course of his life forever. Who is Clara, and what does she really want? When secrets from the past resurface, Victor is forced to confront a devastating truth he's tried to forget. Get ready for a story of lost love, emotional reunions, and the discovery of what it really means to be one. Family. But be careful. Nothing is as it seems, and each revelation can change everything. Are you ready to discover the truth? Amelia, you know that this house doesn't work without you. Victor's voice was firm, but it didn't hide his discomfort. Amelia looked at him, her face calm, as always. He had worked in that house for almost 2 decades and knew Victor well enough to understand what he really meant. Mr. Galvez, I've already stayed longer than I should have. My daughter needs me now, and it's time for me to go. His answer was as gentle as it was definitive. Victor frowned, leaning back in the leather office chair. Silence filled the room for a few moments before he shook his head. Family always ruining plans. He muttered to himself, but Amelia heard. Maybe that's why you always avoid having it, she replied, smiling slightly, but without challenging him too much. He watched her leave the office with firm steps. I didn't like goodbyes, much less changes. However, the next morning, change arrived in the form of Clara, the new maid. So, you're Amelia's replacement? Victor asked while adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. Yes, sir. I hope to meet your expectations. Clara kept her head down, her voice controlled. Victor analyzed her briefly. Young, seemingly discreet, but something about her posture seemed too rigid, as if she were on constant alert. He didn't have time to go deep into thought. He just nodded. Good. I don't like surprises. Do your job and everything will be fine. Clara nodded, moving quickly to organize the house. He followed her with his eyes for a few moments before getting lost in his own reflections. Something about her presence felt out of place, but he dismissed the sensation, focusing back on his business. As Clara adjusted the curtains upstairs, she looked out the window, taking a deep breath. Being there wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity for answers. Victor watched the mansion through his computer screen, the images from the security cameras switching from one room to another. He had installed the system years ago, but rarely used it. Now he felt compelled to test the new employee. Let's see how trustworthy you are, Clara, he muttered to himself. Leaving the safe in the office partially open, he left the house that morning without mentioning anything. The afternoon passed without incident, but upon reviewing the recordings, he noticed something intriguing. On the screen, Clara entered the office. Victor squinted, watching as she ignored the safe and moved toward the bookshelf. His breathing got heavier when he saw her pick up an old photo album. Clara slowly leafed through the pages until she stopped at a specific one. After a few seconds, she took out a photograph and put it in her pocket. Victor paused the video, feeling a mix of anger and curiosity. He recognized that photo. It was from an old trip with Rosa, a fragment of a past that he preferred to leave buried. When he arrived home, he found Clara in the kitchen, organizing dishes. Clara. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. She turned quickly, eyes wide. Yes, sir? Were you in the office today? He took a step forward, crossing his arms. Clara hesitated, but then nodded. Yes, sir. I was cleaning there. Cleaning? He tilted his head, his eyes fixed on hers. So tell me, why was the safe open? And why is a photo missing from my album? Clara turned pale, her lips trembling as she tried to respond. I can explain. Then explain. Victor replied, his patience clearly exhausted. Clara took a deep breath but said nothing. He just took the photo out of his pocket and placed it on the table. Victor looked at the image, Rosa's face smiling at him. anger mixed with ancient pain, but he maintained his composure. "Tomorrow, in my office. Let's discuss this." He turned abruptly, leaving Clara alone with her worries. Victor was sitting at his office desk, his fingers drumming on the wooden top as he stared at Clara. She was standing before him, her eyes fixed on the floor as if awaiting a sentence. "I'll ask you one last time." Victor broke the silence, his voice sharp. "Why did you take the photograph?" Clara slowly raised her head. His expression was a mix of fear and determination. "Because she's the only lead I have." His voice was low but firm. "The woman in this photo? Pink, she is my mother." Victor froze, surprise running through him like a shock. He grabbed the photograph, looking again at Rosa's smile. The past seemed to invade the present with a force he couldn't control. "Your mother?" He laughed humorlessly, shaking his head. "That doesn't make sense." "Why do you think this?" Clara took a deep breath, crossing her arms as if trying to protect herself. "My mother always spoke of a man called Victor. She said he was my father, but he disappeared before finding out about me." Victor stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth. The idea seemed absurd, but Clara's words echoed buried memories. "This is ridiculous. I never—" He stopped, looking at the photograph again. The trip, Rosa's smile, the moments he had buried with so much effort. "I didn't come here for money or revenge, Mr. Galvez," Clara continued, her voice full of emotion. "I came because I need to know the truth." Victor stared at her, his mind a whirlwind. He wanted to deny it, wanted to throw her out of there, but something in her voice, in the determination in her gaze, made him hesitate. "What if you're wrong?" he finally asked. "Then I will know. But if I'm right—" Clara paused, her eyes filling with tears. "I need to know why you left me." Silence filled the office. Victor felt the weight of Clara's words like an iron chain around his heart. He had no answers, only vague memories and the feeling that the past was about to take its toll. Victor sat on the edge of the bed, Rosa's photo in his hands. The night was silent, but his mind was in chaos. He closed his eyes and let the long-buried memories come flooding back. It was a hot afternoon, and Rosa laughed as the wind ruffled her hair. They were sitting in a park, a notebook between them. "You always want to control everything, Victor," Rosa said, laughing. "Not everything in life can be planned." "If I don't plan, how will I ensure our future is secure?" he replied seriously. Rosa shook her head, smiling. "Sometimes the present is more important." The present. Victor remembered how, at the time, he had ignored her words. His ambition consumed him. He wanted to build something solid, something that could offer Rosa a perfect life. But in the process, he lost her. He also remembered the day everything fell apart. He was in his office dealing with insistent investors when Rosa showed up. "Victor, we need to talk." His voice was choked, but he almost didn't notice. "Not now, Rosa. I'm in the middle of something important." "Me too," she replied, with a broken voice. "I'm in the middle of making a decision about the future of our lives." He didn't realize the weight of those words until it was too late. Rosa was gone, and he never had the courage to look for her. Back in the present, Victor opened his eyes. The photograph seemed more alive now, as if it carried all the regret he had accumulated. Clara couldn't be lying. The timeline made sense, and the similarity was undeniable. The next day, Victor went downstairs and found Clara in the living room. She looked at him nervously. "Let's talk to your mother," he said, surprising them both. "Are you serious?" Clara asked hesitantly. "If there's a chance you're right, we need to know the truth." Victor held the photograph, his gaze fixed on the past. "It's time to face this." Victor and Clara stopped in front of a modest house on the outskirts of the city. The air was charged with tension. Clara looked at the door as if it could open on its own, while Victor kept his gaze fixed on the floor, holding the photograph tightly. Finally, Clara took a deep breath and knocked. The door was opened by a woman who, although aged, maintained a firm posture. Pink. Victor felt a wave of emotions that he couldn't name when he saw her after so long. Rosa froze when she saw Victor, her eyes wide with surprise. "Victor," she whispered, almost in disbelief. What are you doing here?" Before he could respond, Clara joined the conversation. "Mom, I need you to tell me the truth about him." Clara pointed to Victor. "Is he my father?" Rosa blinked several times as if trying to process the scene. Finally, he gestured for them to enter. Inside the house, the silence was oppressive until Rosa spoke, her voice full of emotion. "I didn't know you were still alive to ask that, Victor." Rosa looked at him with a mixture of sadness and bitterness. "You left me, never returned." "I didn't leave you," Victor interrupted, his voice firm. "You left. I never knew you were pregnant." Rosa stared at him in disbelief. "How did you not know? Helena said you knew. She told me you didn't want anything to do with me anymore. That his career was more important." Victor felt shock go through him. Helena, Rosa's sister. He remembered the tense conversations he had with her at the time, but he never imagined she would be capable of something like this. "Helena lied," Victor said, more to himself than to Rosa. "I would never have done that. Everything I did was for both of us." Rosa shook her head, tears flowing silently. "So, all these years, it was all a mistake." His voice broke. Clara, who until then had remained silent, took a step forward. "We cannot change the past, but maybe we can understand what happened." Rosa looked at her daughter and then at Victor. Finally, he nodded. "She's yours, Victor. Clara is your daughter." The weight of her words fell on him like thunder. Victor didn't know how to respond. But one thing was certain. He needed to do something about it. The past had been cruel, but the future was still before him. Victor was sitting on the small sofa in Rosa's house, watching Clara play with an old box of photos that she had found in a corner of the room. Rosa sat in front of him, her hands clasped in her lap. The silence between them was thick, but filled with unspoken emotions. "I don't know where to start." Victor finally spoke, his voice softer than he intended. Rosa looked up, a small, tired smile appearing on her lips. "Maybe it's too late to start, but it's never too late to try." He shook his head, guilt reflected on his face. "I spent years believing I was doing the right thing, working to build something that could sustain us, that could give us security. But all I did was walk away from you." "I made mistakes too," Rosa replied, her eyes filling with tears. "I believed in Helena. I thought you had abandoned me. I should never have left without talking to you." Victor looked at her, regret almost suffocating him. "And Clara?" he asked, gesturing to his daughter. "How did you manage to raise her alone? It must have been so difficult." "He was," Rosa admitted, but there was a gleam of pride in her voice. "But it was worth it. Clara was my strength all these years." Clara looked at them, interrupting the moment. "I know you're trying to understand each other, but what about me?" His voice was firm, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes. "How do I fit into all this?" Victor stood up, walking towards her. He hesitated for a moment before placing a hand on her shoulder. "You are my daughter," he said, with a tone that carried more certainty than he felt. "And if you allow it, I want to be in your life. I can't change the past, but I can try to build something now." Clara stared at him for a moment before nodding. "Let's see, but it won't be easy." Victor smiled slightly. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt there was a purpose beyond work and loneliness. When they left Rosa's house that night, Victor held the photograph that had caused all this change. He put it carefully in his coat pocket. The past still hurt, but the future looked promising. The soft rays of the morning sun illuminated the garden of Victor's mansion. He was sitting on a lounge chair, watching Clara and Rosa as they planted flowers in a small flower bed nearby. Their laughter filled the air, a melody that seemed surreal to Victor. The house, once silent and empty, now pulsed with life. Clara ran to him, a sunflower seedling in her hands. "You're not going to just stand there, are you?" she asked with a mischievous smile. "We need help." Victor stood up, pretending to mumble. "I don't know how I was convinced to do this. It doesn't seem like something a successful businessman should be doing." Clara rolled her eyes. "Sounds like something a father should be doing." He stopped, her words touching a place he didn't know existed. Father. It was a title he never thought he would have, but one he now carried with a mixture of fear and pride. He took Clara's seedling and began to dig a small hole in the ground. Rosa, observing the scene, approached. His expression was one of relief and gratitude. "You've really changed, Victor," she said, crossing her arms as she looked at the garden. "I don't know if I've changed," he replied without taking his eyes off the ground. "I think I'm finally learning to live." She smiled and placed her hand on his shoulder. "We are living. Together. That's what matters." That night, after dinner, Victor sat with Clara in the library, a place he rarely visited. Clara looked around, marveling at the shelves full of books. "Have you read all of these?" she asked, picking up an old volume. "Lots of them." He admitted it. "But maybe now I should start reading stories you like. We can choose something together." Clara laughed. "I think I like that idea." Victor looked at her, a feeling of peace washing over him. He had spent years believing that success was measured by what he had, but Clara and Rosa had shown that the true value lay in the connections he almost lost. As he turned off the lights in the library that night, Victor felt something new. Hope. Not because of the distant future, but because of what he was already building, day after day, with those two women who had changed his life.